Bom dia a todos. Hoje a gente está com a professora Cheryl. A professora Cheryl, ela estuda a parte de risco de psicoses, né? Ela estuda a parte de linguagem, então tudo que é, não só a linguagem em si, mas as pausas que se fazem durante a fala de um paciente psicótico. Ela é da Faculdade de Medicina, ela é professora na Faculdade de Medicina de Mount Sinai, em Nova York, e ela vai participar do simpósio, né, esse final de semana aqui no IPQ. Então, please, Professor Cheryl, the floor is yours. And just let me open your presentation.
Thank you. And to advance, to move it. Okay. Oh, these. Okay. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, Dr. Luck, and also Daniela. I feel like I have like a hemi-paresis, so everybody is on that side. No one is on this side, so I will lead like this.
We put the camera from this side.
I'm very sorry. I don't speak any Portuguese at all, so my apologies. I wish I did, but I don't. So I will tell you about, and thank you, work that we're doing to analyze behavior, speech and language and face expression. It's going to do that the whole time, isn't it? Especially in people with psychosis and who are at risk for psychosis. And I am a psychiatrist, and I collaborate with engineers and physicists, many and computer scientists to do this work using artificial intelligence to study behavior. And many of my colleagues actually are from South America. I work with Guillermo Chechi, who's at IBM in New York, who's originally from Argentina. I work with Natalia Mota, who's from the Northern University, Norte, and also Siddhartha Ribeiro, who I just saw last week in New York, who also does language analyses. And I work also with some people in Chile who are doing language analyses and psychosis. And it's my great pleasure to work with Alexandra and his team, who were awarded a Wellcome Trust grant from the United Kingdom to do similar work to what I'll present. So this work has been done mostly in English, a little bit in Spanish and Portuguese, a little bit in Dutch, actually increasingly in Chinese, and some other languages. I think it's very exciting. So let me tell you about this work we've been doing. So Steven Pinker is at MIT. He's written a number of books on language and worked with Noam Chomsky, who's a linguist. And he said language is a window into the mind. And if you think as a psychiatrist, everything you do has to do with language. The way that you diagnose, we have no tests for psychiatry. There's no blood test. You can't make a diagnosis with an MRI. Everything we do in psychiatry is language. It could be what people tell us. Are there symptoms? That's part of how we make a decision. It's our observation of people. People with schizophrenia look odd or unusual. Often when someone with schizophrenia walks in the door, we know the diagnosis before we have even started to talk to them. My colleagues who study autism say the same thing about autism. It's the gestalt of the individual. And so all we have now are clinical ratings. But to go back to language, so what people tell us, how they say it, and then also the notes other doctors write, all language. And how do we treat people? We have medicine, we have some brain stimulation, but a lot of our treatment is also talking to someone. The therapy itself is language. So it's very interesting. Language is so important for psychiatry. I study psychosis, and in psychosis, it's not so much the content, what people say, that tell us about the diagnosis, it's how they say it. They tend to go off track, they're tangential, they have looseness of association, or they could be very concrete, not say very much with short sentences, but we have no way yet to quantify that. But we can do that working with computer scientists using artificial intelligence and natural language processing. Outside of psychosis, other disorders like psychosis, where the structure of language matters, is autism, Alzheimer's, a lot of the psychiatric disorders that are sort of neurological, but other disorders, you can look at the content. Depression, you can look at the content of what people are saying. Anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's just what people say. And then also how the acoustics of their voice, you know if somebody is anxious, you know if somebody is depressed, and also their face expression. So I'll go through all of this through the lens of psychosis. And then the other interesting thing, besides using computers to look at what people say, how they say it, what their face expression is to do that in a dyad between two people, the clinician and the patient. If you record both individuals, you get a lot of information, because a conversation is very synchronized and well-timed. If I talk fast, you talk fast. If I sound depressed and you're a clinician, your voice will start to get soft. If you talk to a manic patient, you feel the mania, you also express it. In a study of children with autism, they, at the end of their sentences, their prosody would go up like a sing-song, and the clinicians who interviewed them would start picking that up as well. So it's just a rich source of information. And if you want to do research and look at all of this, it's very easy. All you need is a microphone. All you need is an iPad. Apple makes some of the best cameras around and the best microphones. And we're now collecting a lot of our data via Zoom, because with the pandemic, a lot of people don't want to come in, including patients. And so with telepsychiatry and telehealth, you can now, it's so easy to record. We wanted to record interviews for years. Every week we'd meet. Do we use this camera? Do we use that camera? What's the angle? Now we have Zoom. You just press record, and you have to press record in a way that you capture the raw data. But if you want to do this research, it's very easy and very inexpensive. You just need the permission, of course, of the patient, and then you need some good computer scientists to work with. So I'm going to talk about psychosis. That's what I do, like Dr. Locke. Oh, you want to get rid of that, okay. So I think I put this up here, even though I know you all know schizophrenia, you're in psychiatry, but this is what I study. And in these slides, everything that is blue has to do with language. So the positive symptoms of schizophrenia include hallucinations and delusions, but it also includes disorganized communication. And although everybody knows about word salad and formal thought disorder, right, when you meet the person with schizophrenia who's not making any sense, almost like they have a Wernicke's aphasia, that's at one extreme. But even people at very early stages of psychosis or who are at risk for psychosis have subtle disturbances in language. I do clinical high-risk research. Teenagers, young adults who have some psychotic-like symptoms, they're at risk for schizophrenia. Some of them, as I talk to them, sentence to sentence, they make sense. But we could talk for like 10 minutes. I stop and I think, what did we talk about? Each sentence made sense, but they didn't really connect over time. It can be subtle, and we can pick that up with computers. In terms of negative symptoms, this alogia or concreteness, poverty of speech, and then a lot of the cognitive deficits that you see in schizophrenia, where it's one standard deviation below the mean, and in clinical high risk, it's a half standard deviation below the mean. These cognitive deficits both can contribute to language disturbance, and also if people have trouble with language, when you do these tests, they may not fully understand, or their language impairments may get in the way. So in schizophrenia, there are deficits in processing speed, verbal memory, verbal fluency. All of these are related to language. And even the mood symptoms, I don't have them in blue, but we can study them. You can use what's called natural language processing that I'll tell you about in a little while to look at the content of speech, in not just in schizophrenia, but much more broadly. People who are suicidal will tend to use more words that have semantic similarity to stress and hopelessness. So you could look at content. The other thing about suicidal ideation, and also for actually most psychiatric disorders and even most medical disorders, is that when people are ill, they will use the first person pronoun more than when they're not ill, or as compared to people who are not ill. So when you're ill, you tend to say I, me, my. You get more of a focus on yourself in speaking and writing, and you can pick that up with these natural language processing methods. So this is just a review of schizophrenia. It's a developmental trajectory. So these are longitudinal, based on longitudinal studies following people from early on, from childhood through adulthood. These studies have been done in the UK, the United Kingdom, also in a lot of the Scandinavian countries. Israel has these longitudinal cohort studies, also New Zealand. So on average, toddlers who go on to develop schizophrenia as adults will have delays in both walking and talking. Around the age of 4 to 6, children who are on their way to schizophrenia have speech problems. So schizophrenia is really a neurodevelopmental disorder, and Alexandre and I do this work trying to identify teens and young adults at risk for schizophrenia. And that picture is called clinical high risk or prodromal. It's to, people with schizophrenia have a prodrome. They don't get ill like that. Some do, but most don't. Most have this steady decline that leads up to a first episode of psychosis. And even in that period, when you see this emergence of psychotic-like symptoms, a lot of social withdrawal, you could capture these subtle language disturbances. So I'm just going to review this. 80% of schizophrenia cases are preceded by a prodrome. 20% have an acute onset, so you won't capture a prodrome for them. And during this time, individuals develop subthreshold psychotic symptoms. And if you've met teenagers or young adults who have this, it's really fascinating, heartbreaking, but fascinating to talk to them because they are starting to have psychotic-like symptoms. They know that what they're experiencing is might be perceived as crazy by others. They tend not to tell other people, they withdraw. And the psychotic symptoms that they have, all of the different psychotic symptoms that you can have, they have in what's called attenuated or subthreshold form. And what makes the difference between it being risk and threshold psychosis are two things. One is that they still have insight or skepticism. They grapple with the symptoms. Is this really true? Whereas if somebody is psychotic, they're sure, right? They're sure, they have conviction. But during this time, they're like, I don't know, I'm thinking this thing, but I'm not sure if that's real. But sometimes they say, well, maybe it is real. They're grappling with it. And you can have that in any kind of delusion, in sort of the form fruste or attenuated form. So this is an example of someone I met about 10 years or so ago in New York, an electrical engineering student, and he would fantasize about having wings. And he would spend all day, he wasn't doing his work, thinking about flying over New York, which is kind of beautiful, with his wings and seeing the skyscrapers and the people. This was not so unpleasant, but was getting in the way of his function. But there were other things that were upsetting to him. So the color white would make him uneasy. He felt that it had a special meaning. He worried about seeing dead bodies along the road at night. He didn't feel like somebody was out to get him, but he was suspicious. This one person didn't have grandiose thoughts, but you could have grandiose thoughts as well. And some people, they hear what I'm saying and they say, that sounds psychotic. Why do you not call this psychosis? It's because he himself was still grappling with it. He was not sure if this was real or not. And with a number of people who have this, teenagers and young adults, it will resolve by itself. And we tend not to give antipsychotics at this stage. We watch people. If it gets worse or dangerous, we give antipsychotics. But because antipsychotics have such severe side effects, all of them, in teens and young adults, and there are a number of what are called false positives for people who will develop psychosis, we're very careful about prescribing antipsychotics. We use cognitive behavioral therapy, actually. I could tell you more about that. But so this is psychosis risk. And these individuals will also, rather than hearing voices of people telling them to do things or talking about them, they might hear their name in the wind or colors look different. So they have overvalued thoughts, they have illusions. So these are the people that I study. They also, this is not trivial, they have functional impairment. Their grades tend to go down over time, and they have an active social withdrawal and a lot of anxiety, social anxiety, and trouble with motivation. And we have an interview, actually, it's about to be replaced by another interview, but it's called the Structured Interview for Psychosis Risk, where we can test, we ask a lot of questions, sort of subtle questions to get at psychotic-like experiences. And then we rate these 5 things. This scale was derived from the positive and negative syndrome scale, or the PANS. For those of you who do research, you may know this instrument. And so we do ratings of all of these. And 0 is no symptoms, and 6 is psychotic. They've crossed the line. It goes from 0 to 6. And then 3 to 5 is considered in this prodromal or clinical risk stage. And it can be tricky for the differential diagnosis, as you could imagine. So each of these we have to think about. Unusual thoughts could be like obsessions. The The unusual thoughts in clinical high risk tend to be more odd. What you get in for obsessions are less odd. Also, the unusual thoughts clinical high risk or schizophrenia patients have tend not to be, they can be, but tend not to be cleanliness or order, tends to be more bizarre, aggressive obsessions. We have to think about autism for the differential diagnosis, mood disorder, substance abuse, because cannabis is very common in our cohort, cannabis use, and also can, in individuals who have the liability, elicit psychosis. But this is who we study. And this is one of the ratings. This is, I think, for disorganized communication. And just to show, 6 is severe and psychotic. We never see that. Pretty much among clinical high-risk individuals, I want you to notice that 3, because I'll show you some data from clinical high risk showing that just a score of 3 for this one domain is predictive of who will develop psychosis. And it's just occasional irrelevant words, irrelevant topics, going off track, stereotyped or elaborate speech. So my computer scientists colleagues think, how can I model that with a computer? So first I'll show you and predict psychosis onset. So this clinical high risk syndrome that I've talked about, the same that Dr. Locke studies, about 15 to 20% will develop psychosis, usually schizophrenia, within 2 years. So it's sort of our best shot for trying to identify people who are at risk for schizophrenia. And I've done my own studies, and now I'm part of this big international effort. Actually, Brazil, unfortunately, is not involved, but Chile has a site for doing clinical high risk, finding them in 42 sites around the world, and then doing all kinds of tests at baseline, right? Because before you have your whole cohort, 20% will develop psychosis, 80% won't. You want to really characterize those people when they first come in. EEG, MRI, blood, fluid biomarkers, blood, saliva for cortisol, to find out what predicts who develops psychosis or not. And so one of the biomarkers is also language and using computers to study language. So this was a study that we did. I'm putting photos of the people who did the studies. And so basically, in this study, we had a cohort of clinical high-risk individuals. We followed them for 2 years. We assessed them every 3 months. And survival, right, for survival analysis, if you're looking at the outcome of conversion to psychosis, the survival is how long do they go without developing psychosis. We did latent trajectory analysis because we had assessments at baseline and every 3 months for quite a while. So that figure on the left, those are, that should not say, oh yes, it is years. So we assessed people regularly, and these were the ratings for disorganized communication. And the last slide I told you to pay attention to 3. You can see here that almost nobody scores a 4 or a 5. It's that occasionally going off track, etc. Those individuals who had a 3, just occasionally going off track, and it was pretty stable over time, that green trajectory, those were the ones who developed psychosis. The others who either had maybe a little bit in the beginning and then it declined, or didn't have any disorganized communication at all, they did not develop psychosis. And that's the survival curve on the right. And the green are the ones who had this baseline disorganized communication mild at 3 that stayed stable over time. And they had, each drop is when somebody develops psychosis. So you see in green, they developed psychosis more quickly. That hazard rate was 2. the odds ratio was 2. So it doubles your risk if you're clinical high risk to also have this language disturbance. So this is clinical ratings, right? So I'm here to tell you that clinical ratings are, they're good, they're a good tool, they're what we use. But if you think clinical ratings have a lot of problems, right? First of all, they tend to be 0 to 6. They're one rating. They don't tell you about different aspects of language, just one person doing one rating. You have to think about inter-rater reliability. If you and I see the same patient, would we give them the same score? You have to worry about retest reliability. If I see them now, if I see them next week, would I give them the same score? So, but it's useful. But if you think like in cardiology, if we just did clinical ratings, it'd be terrible. So in psychiatry, we want to try to get beyond clinical ratings to get to something we can quantify, that's more sensitive, that's more reliable, and that hopefully can tell us something about what's going on in the brain and the body, so we could think about what are the circuits and what are the treatments that we could do. That prediction. So those are clinical ratings. So one of my colleagues, Carrie Bearden at UCLA, and this was a number of years ago, wanted to go beyond clinical ratings, and so did manual ratings. Now these are really labor intensive, and you have your staff and they get trained and they count things. They learn how to identify different features of language and they count them. It's a little bit more detailed and more sensitive and captures more things than clinical ratings. It's better, but it's so labor intensive. She did this in a study of clinical high risk individuals. She used a paradigm that had been used in children with schizophrenia, where basically the participants would hear a story and they would answer questions about the story, and then they'd have to tell their own story. And this was all recorded, and then the people coded it. So there were two things that they looked at in particular. One was illogical thinking. And this is an example of illogical thinking. I went to school today because my name is Tom. That's not logical, right? You don't go to school because of your name. And the second one, poverty of content, you've met people like this. Maybe, I don't know, well, yes, I see. And so they're not really saying anything. The sentences are not long, there's not ideas, there's not content. So what she found, do I have, oh yeah, I do have that instead of a pointer. So here in this figure, the blue are the CHR's clinical high risk, plus means they developed psychosis eventually. This was at baseline. So the ones who developed psychosis had a lot more illogical thinking and a lot more poverty of content. And that illogical thinking is like positive symptoms, positive thought disorder, going off track, being tangential, and the poverty of content is like negative thought disorder and decrease in complexity, being concrete, et cetera. So you've seen this. So think about those two, because then we want to figure out how can my computer scientist friends model these? So can we use computers to characterize these language disturbances? Well, this first one of going off track, which we call semantic coherence, you can use what are called word embedding programs. We had started using something called latent semantic analysis. I'll tell you about it. This was developed by someone named Landauer, and he actually, in addition to coming up with computer algorithms, writes beautifully. And I would suggest his papers to you. He has a paper, I think it's like the solution to Plato's problem. And apparently Plato came up with the question, how can people know so much when they are told so little? You know, how can children just by being among other people, learn language. You know, how's that possible? Especially at that time, computers couldn't do that. You had to tell computers everything. You know, computers have come a long way since then, but how did children do this? And it's this idea that the brain of a child, and he tried to model this in his algorithm, a child hearing words will start to understand how some words are more similar, how are different. They start to make inferences. They start to put it all together. If someone's pointing and saying, you know, chair, that's not an inference. But when they hear language, they start to put things together. And so he developed an algorithm to try to do that with computers. The syntactic complexity is a little bit easier. Some of the people here who are more my age, I don't know what they do in Brazil, but when I was a kid, on the blackboard, there would be this whole tree. I'll show you. You know, it's this part of speech, that part of speech, so a computer can do that too. And this is called natural language processing. So the computer processes natural language. And if any of you want to play around with this, there's a website called NLTK, Natural Language Toolkit. If you have free time. So the idea is to be more objective than clinical ratings, less time consuming than manual linguistic analysis. And then in the US, to get grants, we have this thing called RDoC, Research Domain Criteria, to try to move away from the diagnostic manual, right, the DSM, and to think more about domains and how they relate to brain function. So this is linguistic corpus-based paradigm to study language production. There's the website, and then Guillermo's who I collaborate with. So semantic coherence. So if you look here on the left, right, and you've probably seen these kinds of figures before. Whoops. There we go. So if these are words huge and tiny in a space or closer to each other because they're doing size, apple, banana, pear, or fruit, and you have colors down here, parts of the body, the next word that comes along, white, you or computer will tend to put that with the colors, right? We've learned this kind of sorting. And so each of these words, every word in English, every word in Portuguese can be given a semantic vector. You take that word and you compare it, here, it's down here. You get a really large corpus of text, and then you have a matrix, and each word is in this matrix. And then you look at the co-occurrence patterns. So colors will tend to occur more often together than a color and a noun. Or for instance, you see here on the top, if you had lots and lots of text, and computers have that now, they have corpuses, you would find that sweet, fruit, flower would tend to be more together. Asteroid might be with something else. And so then the computer can create a vector, a semantic vector, based on this matrix analysis of looking at co-occurrence. And then you could see how similar words are, semantic similarity, by looking at their vectors. And with vectors, if they are similar in direction, you can look at the cosine value between them. There we go. So the coherence, so if you think each word, right, has a vector that points in a certain direction, and you look at a sentence, and if you've done this is like basic with vector analysis, so I didn't do it in high school, so a sentence is the sum of all the word vectors. And speech goes in time. So you have a sentence vector as people are talking, it's going like this. When someone goes off track, that next vector will be like, whoa, pointing in the other direction. It's kind of like the non-mathematician's explanation of it, but this is how you can look at semantic similarity and coherence in language using computational models. And the first one that we used was this latent semantic analysis. This is also called word embedding. So other approaches have been glove to vec, a word to vec, glove to vec. If you do anything with natural language processing, now the program is called BERT, B-E-R-T. So, you know, every year it gets improved, but this is word embedding to look at semantic similarity. And this is how we can look at coherence in speech. This is the most complicated part of the talk. The part of speech tagging, just like every word in English or every word in Portuguese, can get a semantic vector, right, that tells you about its meaning. Each word can get a part of speech tag. But the context matters, right? I don't know Portuguese at all, but in English, like dog is an animal, but dog can also mean to like bother someone, to chase them, to dog them. So you can think, I'm sure in Portuguese, of several words that can operate in some contexts as a noun, sometimes as a verb. So there is a probabilistic aspect, and the computer manages that by looking at context. But nonetheless, you can, when each word gets a, and this is Noam Chomsky, each word gets a tag. And then by knowing grammatical rules, you can know how long a sentence is by the sequence of part of speech tags, because it's a sequence. So my collaborator, Guillermo, originally from, not from Buenos Aires, he's from Mar del Plata, I think, in Argentina. We've worked together for about 10 years. And so he was very interested in trying to model this coherence problem with latent semantic analysis and the complexity problem with part of speech tagging. And it was very interesting because I was just doing my clinical high-risk research. This was truly serendipity. I had a colleague who was doing substance abuse research, and she said, do you have any transcripts from clinical high-risk individuals? And I did, because I had a research assistant who at one time said, I'm tired of asking people questionnaires all day. I want to know what their experience is. I want to do qualitative research. I'm like, great, we'll do it. It's inexpensive. We'll write the research permissions. And she did that. So we had all these transcripts. It was from a number of years ago, so we knew who developed psychosis and who didn't. So what we found, it was only 34 people and 5 developed psychosis. So very small, proof of principle. As computer scientists would say, this model is totally overfitted. Fine, all of it is true. But what we found that this semantic coherence, sentence to sentence, was one feature of a machine learning classifier that predicted who developed psychosis. That was the semantic coherence. We also found that sentence length predicted. The people with shorter sentences were more likely to develop psychosis. The other feature was something that in English is called determiner pronouns, like which and that. And those are more complex sentences that have which and that. It means the sentences have a dependent clause. So that's a measure of complexity. So that sentence length and the coherence completely distinguished who developed psychosis from who didn't. Again, very, very small sample. And what this is for machine learning it's called a convex hull classification. What convex hull is you take all the data points in a set and you put them in a space and you try to minimize the space that those data points are in. It's almost like you shrink wrap. You know, you go to the airport and you have like a suitcase and they can wrap it, or, you know, to really wrap something tight, or vacuum seal. It's a complex polyhedron. And so this is a machine learning classification. And what he found was that those individuals who did not develop psychosis were all inside, and those who developed psychosis the ones who didn't develop psychosis, the blue, were all inside, and the ones who did were red and outside. So this is proof of principle suggestive we could use computer science to try to look at language and its ability to predict psychosis. So then he did some tricks. This is looking at correlation, and the idea of this was to look at validity. So was it associated with the clinical ratings? They were. These three features were associated with ratings of positive and negative symptoms. They were more predictive, but they were also related. A sort of convergent validity test. And then he likes to read, so he wanted to make sure the semantic coherence was a real thing. So he took the texts of mostly English, some in French. You see Conan Doyle, Melville, Darwin, and he scrambled the text and then measured them. And when he scrambled the text, you could induce this decrease in semantic coherence. And then this is the complexity on the right. And I don't know, you see right here are the people who develop, psychosis. They're pretty low. And I don't know how much you know American writers, but Mark Twain writes very simply, and he's here, there he is, near the individuals who develop psychosis. Darwin, Doyle were more, have more complex writing style, so he was sort of playing. Interestingly, we took the same classifier and to see how would it perform in discriminating schizophrenia from healthy individuals. And this is 18 schizophrenia, 12 controls. And we did the same convex hull classification. And only one of the schizophrenia patients was outside this hull. So just like before, everybody inside the hull, those are the people who don't develop psychosis. So in schizophrenia and in clinical high risk who are going to develop schizophrenia, they have variance from the norm. That's true for other biomarkers as well. But here, whatever is inside that hull is kind of like normal language. And then outside is how people deviate. And then this is Natalia Mota, who is my colleague, who is Brazilian. I've worked with her. At the time, Guillermo and I said, we were curious, how does this perform in other languages? So she has done these same kind of language analyses in Brazil, people with schizophrenia. And so she had language samples. So she sent us the language samples. We put them through Google Translate into English, and then did the machine learning classifier. Actually, it's amazing. I can anticipate some of the questions, but it's amazing how robust these classifiers are across languages. You could say, well, English, Portuguese, I mean, I can't understand a word of Portuguese, but I understand some Spanish, and you know, English, Spanish, Portuguese are not as different from each other as, say, they are from Chinese or Arabic, right? But at least within sort of European Romance languages, these things carry. We have a recent study, actually, with a Chinese sample of clinical high risk, finding that these same coherence and complexity features matter. But anyway, so she gave us her data, and this little classifier, 80%, not bad, could distinguish who in her transcripts of interviews in Portuguese, of course, had schizophrenia and who didn't. So then what we did was, you remember that study I showed you from California? I went to school today because my name is Tom. So my colleague said, this looks interesting. Here's my data. See what you can do. And so, yeah, there it is. And so Guillermo took these data and did the same thing and came up with another machine learning classifier. It was not exactly the same because our interviews were very open-ended. People would speak for hundreds of words before we would interrupt. This other study was more structured. People had to remember a story, tell a story. But so he was able to identify a machine learning classifier that had a lot of coherence features in it, and these automated features were highly correlated with illogical thinking and poverty of content. So again, that kind of convergence, that's a form of validity. So the automated features were highly correlated with the manual features. And then this is a receiver operating curve, or ROC. Hope you guys know that. On the left is true positive. On the y-axis, on the x-axis is false positive. This is a way to look at accuracy. And the closer the arcs are to the left-hand top corner, the better the model. But if you just look above, so this classifier from California, that data, I went to school because I'm Tom, that data, the classifier he came up with had 83% accuracy. The classifier derived from the Los Angeles data set had 83% accuracy in predicting who would develop psychosis. Took that same classifier, applied it to our New York data, and got 79% accuracy. And then also looked at healthy and psychosis in LA and could differentiate. The 79% accuracy is what is so important about this study. What it showed was cross-validation. So it's always easy in any cohort, usually easy, to come up with a machine learning classifier that can differentiate groups. But when you take that classifier and apply it to an independent cohort and it works, then you can believe it, if that makes sense. You got to cross-validate it. And you'll read studies where people in one cohort kind of split it, and then within that cohort had a training and a test data set, and it's like, okay, but it's really still the same cohort. But if you take it and you apply it to a wholly different cohort, so this was very exciting. This meant that there was really something there. We cross-validated it. And this is just what these complex wholes look like from the two groups. So we cross-validated it, and still always the normal people are on the inside and the people who go on to develop psychosis already have psychosis are on the outside. So there have been some other natural language processing studies in psychosis risk. Natalia, the one on the bottom, who's Brazilian, who I've worked with, she looks at speech graphs, which are very cool. Each word that someone says, you connect them with arrows, right? Because speech is sequential over time. And people will come back to what they said, right? If they quickly come back to what they said, then their speech is not very complex. If they talk about different things and come back, it's a little more tangential, perhaps, but it's more complex. And so what she showed was that lower speech, so the less sort of, well, actually, I think I may have gotten that backwards, but anyway, she used a speech graph analysis, she'll be here Saturday, and found that this kind of speech graph analysis could differentiate who developed psychosis. And the one on top was a way to look at sort of the content of speech in terms of art, sort of counting ideas, how many ideas are in a sentence. So that's all that I have with language. So I'm going to tell you now a little bit about what we've been doing with the acoustic aspects of speech and also with face expression. So I was saying this a little bit at the beginning. So language, I guess you can text, you can talk on the phone, but then you have acoustics. But the way that language evolved was really in face-to-face communication. And when we talk to another person, there's all kinds of mirroring and symmetry going on in terms of what we say, how we say it, how fast, et cetera, our facial expression. So one thing with schizophrenia patients is that for a negative symptom, everything is sort of dampened, right? They don't have much to say. Their speech is a little bit of a monotone. Their face expression is flat. So these are negative symptoms that we can model that are very interesting. The other thing is that sometimes the different modalities don't match each other. So someone could be talking about something very sad or frightening, but they're smiling. You know, oh, my mother died this morning. You know, it's like, and then it's an odd affect. You know, sometimes it could be a sort of nervous smile that you could see outside of schizophrenia. You see this mismatch between the modalities, and also just face expressions that people with schizophrenia will make that nobody else makes. Like, for instance, in Psychosis, a few people have studied this, the widening of the eyes, this look, has been associated with psychotic symptom severity. And you could already like kind of see that in like the popular, you know, in the media. You know, if you look at Charles Manson, who killed all those people in California, you look at pictures of him, he, you know, I can't say crazy, I'm a psychiatrist, but other people say he looks crazy. And so what is like in that look that everybody, you know, that a kid could say, I'm not going near that guy, he looks crazy. So how can we sort of quantify that? But looking at human communication in this dyad is really very interesting. There are all kinds of rules about turn taking. If people pause, so if you and I are having a conversation, or you think about meeting with patients, you know, you have the back and forth of the conversation, and then if there's a pause, and it's a long pause, that violates the conventions of what dyadic communication should be. And when people have studied this, it resets the whole discussion. All the ways in which you were synchronized now have to reset after a pause. And people with schizophrenia will have very long pauses. So you can see how these things cause functional impairment, right? This kind of being, and I've had patients describe to me, you know, I want to contribute to the conversation. As soon as I plan what I'm going to say, the conversation has moved on. Those are people who are less sick. The people who are more sick, they look odd. They're also eye contact. They have these long pauses. If they look crazy, actually that looking crazy is very associated with stigma. Alexandra, so if you could get people to look more normal, actually stigma might go down. So this is sort of where we're going next with language. I got a few more minutes. So this was a medical student that we had, and so we had recordings of the transcripts that Guillermo had analyzed. And so she used, all of this is open source software. She used Pratt. Well, she worked with computer scientists. And so the clinical high-risk patients had, and this got published in a PJ Schizophrenia, the clinical high-risk patients had longer pauses, and those pauses were related to their clinical ratings of their negative symptoms, and interestingly, with the complexity of the speech. So individuals who have less complexity pause more. And we call those negative symptoms. And it didn't predict as well as the language. There were male-female differences. It was interesting. So then the next thing we're doing now is face expression. I'm very excited about this. So what's been published so far, because there are all kinds of programs. So people take their video and put it through programs. They're proprietary programs, and the program will come out with a machine learning classifier, sometimes very good. But I don't need a machine to tell me if somebody has schizophrenia or not. I'm more interested in what are the features that distinguish. Black box, right? That's what it's called, a black box that I can't look into. I don't care. Even if you validate it, I don't really care. I want to know what's going on so we could tie it to what's going on in the brain. So this is a pretty old way of looking at face expression called face action units. Are you guys familiar with this? Ekman, have you ever heard of this? You could do training online, so you could detect when people are lying or not. So people can do this manually. You could also do it with electromyography, where you put like little sensors on people's faces. You can measure, these face action units map on to different muscles, and you can measure them. And I'll show you, well, here on the bottom, the circuitry that underlies different face action units is different. So if you remember your neurology, right? So anything that is unilateral is going to be in the actual, like the facial nerve, what they call the direct nerves beyond the cortex. Something that's more bilateral is going to be cortical, right? So you can have like Bell's palsy. You guys know Bell's palsy, right? That's unilateral. That's a facial nerve. That's a nerve itself. But if you have this sort of flattening, and there's something called Cingulate Syndrome, where people look very flat, like schizophrenia, in the context of pretty much normal expression, that's the cingulate. That's back here. And face expression actually is fascinating, because the amygdala is involved in both face expression, but also processing other faces. So when your brain makes a decision about face expression, it's getting all kinds of information. It's getting information from the muscles in your face, what you're already expressing. It's getting information about what you're seeing in the face expression of the other person you're talking to. It's getting data from all of your viscera, right? Because if you stub your toe, you go, ow, right? In your face, you get all this information, and there are iterative loops, and the timing is also very important. Something is breaking down in schizophrenia and people who have these negative symptoms. So we want to quantify what is going on in the face so we could try to figure out what's going on in the brain. So this face action unit in particular, which is called the orbicularis oculi, or lid tightener, it's around the eyes, and it's actually quite big here. It's right here. And this is Steve Heisig, an engineer who I work with, who's done beautiful work in this area. So like I said, you could read it manually, you could hook things up. And now with the video, it's so easy. You get video, you have Zoom. And so over time, multiple studies have shown that this action unit 7, the whole face has decreased amplitude, but especially this orbicularis oculi. And we have data showing that in clinical high risk, that's associated with our clinical ratings of face expression, so convergent validity, but also with impairment in social function. And wanted to say something else so a lot of the proprietary programs now look at like whether people in schizophrenia, other disorders, whether people have happiness. And so people with schizophrenia, less happiness expressed. That's probably related to this action unit 7, and a little bit also action unit 12. But those proprietary programs don't get specific about the action units. And action unit 7 is not, so you know about that kind of like the fake smile when someone smiles with their mouth and not with their eyes. That's action unit 7. Okay, we all know that. And my kids call it in English smizing, and there are other expressions. But we don't just smile with our eyes. We also convey, it's very much a sort of social muscle. We envy, sympathy, all kinds of things. Social interactions, it's really the eyes. So I think it's more complicated than happy or not. We use this program called Pie Feed, an open face. And what you can see here, the green, this is a difference between healthy controls and schizophrenia that you could show in an image. And the green is where they're different. And you see they're different both in this 7 and a little bit in the lip tightener, also involved in smiling. And this is my last slide, because I know you want to leave some time for questions, my last data slide. So now what we're doing is we're trying to put all of this together. So what you see here is, this is the amplitude of speech. There's the subject, there's the interviewer. You know, here I talk, not me, my research assistant, whoops. And then the other person talks and I talk. And you can see where the person is sort of silent, right? Here, these times when they're listening. And you could look at pitch, and then this is face action units. And you can align what people are saying, oops, it keeps doing that, and what their face action units are showing. And if I want you to look right here, so here, the amplitudes are less than elsewhere. And this maps onto an area of speaking where the person is listening. And what we're finding is that when people with schizophrenia are listening or watching, their face drops. The ones with negative symptoms. When they're talking, interestingly, they have much more face expression, but when they listen, they drop. And then the obvious thing to say is, well, yeah, of course, they're not speaking. So, you know, it takes muscles to speak, and when you don't speak, those muscles stop. No, the whole top of the face also stops, and you don't need the top of your face to speak. So there's something, you know, whether it's like, and you know, it's kind of like this blank look, like people are a little maybe overwhelmed. We don't know if maybe it's like cognitive demand, that now when you're, you know, when you're listening, that actually is pretty demanding, because you're listening, but you're also planning what you're going to do next. Anyway, so we're going to look at this more. We're also doing these sort of matrix analyses where we can look at motifs of facial expression and how they change over time. And at the same time, we also have the transcripts. So we can see, you know, when the topic is more like sort of sad or happy, do we see variance with this? So it's this rich, rich data set. And that's where I will end. These are all the people I collaborate with. And I tried my best to make this kind of geographic. So here are everybody in South America. So Guillermo's from, and actually it's the old slide. Guillermo's from Argentina, so it's Romina Mizrahi, Kelly Norell, Diego Fernandez, Carla Goethe, all Argentina. This is Pablo, how could I forget his name? It's from Chile, and then here, of course, Natalia, Alexandra is on my slide, and Siddhartha Ribeiro. And then these are people in California, Wisconsin, New York. Well, you know, we take up a big part of the world. And this is just New York. These are my colleagues in Norway who are doing very cool natural language processing studies up in Arctic Norway. And then here are the Australians. And these individuals are in China and Shanghai, where we're doing similar studies and have found similar things. That's it. Thank you. That's my colleague Guillermo again, who really has done a lot of this work. Okay. I welcome your questions. Who has a question?
I have a question. Well, congratulations and thank you very much for this exciting talk. I have a question about your classifier from Semantic Coherence. How do you deal with the impact of schooling on this language parameters?
It's an excellent question. So the cohorts, the data I showed you were small, and now we have a large cohort in English from Australia. There's a clinical high-risk group there, and also from Canada. And so we are not finding in this larger cohort that's very new. So it's more of an empirical question to some extent. The semantic coherence, we find some association with cognitive effects with the clinical, we're finding, let me slow down. So with the clinic, with the smaller data sets, it's too small. With this larger data set, we're finding correlations with cognitive domains and working memory and processing speed. In terms of education, for these groups in Australia and Canada, a lot of them are in high school or college and haven't completed their education. So their own education in these young people is not a reliable variable yet. And so we're not finding that education for the individual matters. For socioeconomic status, we look more at the parents for that same reason. We actually haven't looked yet in the data. Interestingly, we have found, and this is hundreds of people in cross-section, we have found very few associations, well, almost no associations. I have the slides on another talk on my laptop, for age, sex, or ethnicity. We thought there'd be sex and ethnic differences, and certainly age, but nothing, not for the coherence and not for the complexity, and not in this patient cohort. Now, given that, my work has been in clinical high risk. Natalia has done studies more in individuals who already have psychosis, sometimes who have had schizophrenia for a number of years. And she's done these studies actually right here in Brazil. So she found with the speech graph methods that same least connected component that was related to who would develop psychosis was also related in individuals with recent onset psychosis to who would develop schizophrenia. And then very nicely did a study here in Brazil in, I think, sort of children into adulthood, showing that, and taking into account educational differences, showing that individuals who had schizophrenia had a kind of resistance to education, in that their speech graph features looked like somebody who didn't have the opportunity to have that education. Does that make sense? It's really a beautiful study, and it was done right here in Brazil. And she called it a sort of resistance to learning, like not being able to make available of those educational resources. So within the general population, education was very much related to the speech graph analyses. But in the schizophrenia patients, they just looked like the people who didn't have those opportunities. It's a beautiful study. So it's a great question, and I think the field still is pretty new, that we don't know yet well enough, because it's related to cognition, but then education. And again, Natalia's study is beautiful. I'll try to get the link for you. And she'll be here Saturday, right? So hopefully some of you will come see her at that conference. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? Otherwise, I know what, maybe you're shy. Oh, okay, you're not shy.
In your clinical practice, did you find any change in language or in the face expression after treatment with?
It's a great question. So the question is, how does treatment affect these? So a lot of those studies haven't been done yet with the computational measures. What we found with language, we had a number of people who we interviewed before the pandemic in person, and then via Zoom during the pandemic. And then we looked at, I have that also, we looked at the sort of test, retest is very stable. The language features are very stable. If you think about it, right, I showed you how if you measure every 3 months versus a baseline, you don't get anything extra from the 3 months. The people who develop psychosis have this stable, and when people develop psychosis, it's mostly that they hear voices and have delusions, not that they have word salad. So that's, the language seems to be stable, trait-like. We don't know yet about the face expression. There are some studies for face expression, clinical ratings, where it improved with treatment and others where it didn't. So again, it's like the wonderful question that you asked, that it's this kind of different findings. So, and the field is still pretty young. Even when I tried to, I wrote a grant and I was in PubMed and everywhere looking at studies on face expression in psychosis and schizophrenia. There are a million studies on face recognition and face processing, far, far fewer of face expression. And same with language, same with acoustic speech. So these are great questions. We want to, our whole point in doing this and trying to quantify it is so that these are markers that can be used, say, in a clinical trial, right? So, you know, if you want to compare this medicine and that medicine, one of the things you want to see whether it improves or not is you know, computational measures of language and face and acoustics. But before it can be used in those clinical trials, it has to go through all these tests. So that's what we're doing now, you know, sort of look at the population variance. You know, also, you know, does it matter in terms of education? Look at how convergent validity, I talked about that a few times, the cross-site validation, make sure it's robust. We don't know, this is another question, does it matter who's doing the interviewing, right? So how robust is this also across interviewers? And we're collecting that data now. We're having patients with schizophrenia and a risk for schizophrenia meet with more than one research assistant. And then we want to see, so it's really like to see how robust it is. So we're just at that time. Are you yawning or you have a question? Yawning is fine. Try to think what else. Oh, yes.
I have a question. Thank you. It's a great presentation, nice data. And so I think most of this data can translate what we feel in clinical practice, like you told you, persons comes from through the door and you see, oh, he has a little something, he's odd, but it's very interesting that this can translate this into data. So we have that intuition as a psychiatrist. Oh, he's the way he speaks, or the example you gave. Oh, he talked to me about 10 minutes, but well, I can't remember anything because that was not connected. So, so my question is about the pauses. I think it's most interesting things are when they interact with each other. Can you get like, and this has to do with the study, can you get this sort of data also in speech tests? Like,
that's an excellent question. So you're saying when patients talk to one another?
Or when he's doing speech like Natalia's one about things and telling about the previous days. Like he's not interacting, but he's telling about his memories. How does this data appear when he's not interacting?
So that's another good question. So, you know, this field of research, there's like convergent validity, test, retest reliability, cross-validation, and so population variance, inter-rater reliability, and wait, oh, right, and so thank you. The other question is, the methods. So how do you do this? So how do you collect speech data, and how does it matter? So it depends on the question. So there are a few things. One is in psychosis, if you really want to look at language, you need them to speak for a sufficient amount of time. So the studies we've done have been open-ended, but almost more like a psychoanalysis section where we're like, go on, go on. The reason that we did that was the idea that if it's more of a back and forth, we'll start structuring the patient. And we do that. We help people. You know, if they're trying to make their point, we'll be like, do you mean this? And we'll help people out. So if you really want to give people the chance to go off track, you have to let them talk. But if you, and then there have been studies showing meta-analyses, like Albin Vogel did this in the Netherlands, and others, and not only for Alzheimer's, you can capture coherence better if you let people really speak, and if it's really natural language, as opposed to a paradigm, like even that task, you hear a story, you tell a story. Though Natalia's tell a story, tell me about a dream has worked very well. So, but that's also still kind of open-ended, right? If you want to, so it depends on the question. So you want to find out about coherence, that's the thing to do. But you're not going to get so much with that in terms of face expression. Face expression, it's a little more interesting to make it more dyadic. And so that's why for us, now that we're getting more interested in the dyad, and the social context, we're having our interviews talk a little bit more than they used to, make it more conversational. It's for the question you want to ask. It's like, because we had this beautiful data set for looking at coherence, and we wanted to look at turn taking, and the natural language processing postdoc came back, and I can't really look at turn taking. First of all, there aren't that many turns, and this was to look at semantic content, and she said, but the person would talk for like 100 words, and then the research assistant might say, oh, interesting, tell me more. So you're not going to get a sense of turn taking or coherence between individuals when you do that. So that's why we've shifted our paradigm a little bit. The other thing, though, Alexandra, is that lots of people are just using clinical interviews for a number of reasons. It has ecological validity, but also, like, to make this really useful in the clinic, right? If we say to somebody, well, you have to do this like special language task where you ask people to remember a dream and they tell you, or whatever we can come up with, right? The paradigm. Clinicians are like, I'm so busy, I have to do one more thing. On the other hand, if you just record what they're doing anyway, that data is so rich and can also be really informative. I mean, I think my sense with all of these is that although there's variance from other things, what we're finding, at least for psychosis and schizophrenia, is such a strong signal and so robust that it almost doesn't matter like who's talking to them, what the context is. When you talk to them, maybe it varies a little bit with treatment, but the negative symptoms are hard to treat, and being tangential, I don't know, I've seen some people maybe get on Clozaril and they're a little less tangential, but these things are really stable and sort of sticky and strong. The other thing is, so that's psychosis and schizophrenia, but not everybody wants to study psychosis and schizophrenia. So you could also do the same thing with clinical interviews for anything. And my colleague, Guillermo, now is really interested in looking at, I also want to say we are collecting all this data also in autism, major depression, PTSD, Alzheimer's, so we could also look at the specificity. So the 7 that I was talking about seems to be schizophrenia. Depression is something, this is fascinating, called the omega sign, and it's like kind of like furrowing your brow, and it looks like an omega. And the first person to describe that was Charles Darwin, of all people. And we're finding now in severely depressed patients also they have this omega sign and not the 7 like we're finding in schizophrenia. But anyway, and we're also looking at suicidal ideation. Guillermo now is really interested in looking at psychotherapy and what works. And so there's something called the Working Alliance Inventory for Psychotherapy, where both, and it has kind of a psychoanalytic background, where both the patient and the therapist say, you know, how well is this therapy going? They answer all these questions. The patient's like, I feel heard, I feel understood. And, you know, the therapist is like, yeah, the person paid attention, or whatever. I'd be glad to send it to you. And so he wants to look at, in particular, language. How does a therapist use language effectively to treat the person? It's a great question. And so even if you have data sets, he's so interested in looking at this question. Like he did all this stuff with coherence and psychopathology, and I'm getting the feeling a little bit he's moving on, actually. He's really interested in language as a tool to make people better and trying to figure out what that is. And he's just starting that work now. And, you know, I don't know, like, what do you imagine, right? Like, what's your I'm asking actually all of you so I could bring it back to him. What's your intuition when you do psychotherapy of what works for people?
Well,
Sorry, can you briefly just read lips a little bit?
I think
Or others.
I have studied a lot of that French psychanalyst, Jacques Lacan, who was also a linguist, and he uses a lot of this language and a linguistic approach to psychosis. So he was the one who.
Wow, what's his name?
Jacques Lacan.
Jacques
Lacan.
Oh, Lacan.
Yes.
Oh, Lacan.
Yeah. So we started doing psychoanalysis with psychotic individuals, and I think that works a lot. I don't know.
But not just necessarily specific to psychosis, more broadly.
Yeah, more broadly, I think it's fantastic. There are some things that only works because of linguistic. I think even the medication, they work better if you like.
Yeah, of course.
If you
because medication only works if you take it, and if the patient doesn't like the psychiatrist, they're not going to take his or her medicines, among other things. But so Jacques Lacan. Anybody else? I want to also ask the residents. So as you're doing therapy, what works? Let me bring that back to my colleagues so you could try to model it. Thanks.
I'm going to ask something else.
Oh, that's fine.
So we're talking about language and how a diet, maybe having a social cues and schizophrenia. And I was wondering about migration, especially second generation migrants, who has a higher risk for psychosis. And I guess I got thinking about language and having like dual rapport, like having this language at home, another language when you go out to work, and if there are any studies on migrant population or at-risk migrant population.
That's an excellent question. You should do a study. I think we had qualitative research from years ago, this serendipitous study, and it was in New York. We had a lot of people who came from other countries who were in our study, and the experience. There was this one guy from a country in Africa who described when he was young, it was like Eden, like it was paradise. His family had some money, they had staff, he was the son, There's all this fruit and flowers and animals, really very beautiful. And then something happened between his parents, and they got divorced. His father was from Africa, his mother was Black and from the US. So she came back to the US and didn't get any of the money. So he went from living this fantastic life to coming to New York. He said so many interesting things. So he developed psychosis. The first thing he said was when he landed at JFK Airport in New York, and he got off the plane and went into the terminal, he thought he was surrounded by ghosts because he had never seen so many white people in his life. It was just as amazing. And he had all kinds of imagery like that. And then he was living in a really bad, poor, he was poor. And so then the apartment was small and loud, and everything was gone. And then also, not only did he face discrimination for being Black, he faced discrimination in the schools from people who are African American or Hispanic, people who were poor but who were from the U.S. And so if you think language also represents what you think, but I love this idea. I know that literature very well. When I was here 2 years ago, I think, who is it, Kirkpatrick? He does a lot of that work. We actually had a study years ago for second-generation immigrants, finding the exception to the rule. I did this work with Dolores Malaspina, where second-generation immigrants in Israel did not have an increased risk for schizophrenia. We tried to figure out why. And part of it was that they were actively welcomed and in terms of idea. But that's a great. Do you have time? It's a great research project. I'm sure Natalia would work with you. Are there a lot of immigrants here in Sao Paulo? From where?
From everywhere.
From everywhere? Just from everywhere, like New York.
Yeah, but I think I don't know what to think, but it's sort of different here because we have a neighborhood where they concentrate Chinese and Italians.
Yeah.
So they are very welcomed here. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of it, but sorry to interrupt, but I mean, you're getting at other stuff too, right? I mean, it's like a lot of times a person has, so in that case, right, if you go to an enclave, then you can still speak your language and still have your culture, but if you have to speak a second language, right, if Portuguese is not your first but your second language, how does that affect your thinking? And
because we've been clinically, we don't see a lot of other immigrants.
You don't see a lot of what?
Immigrants with psychosis, but there's the specific example of Japanese immigrants where seems to have a high risk for psychosis.
Really?
And
really?
The whole, maybe it's a hypothesis,
maybe it's what?
Hypothesis of the Second World War, and they didn't want to blend in with Brazilian culture. But it's not like when other cohorts, like when you see American studies or in England, in general, migrants have a higher risk.
But here, so you're observing this, that's how all great research starts, is you notice something and you wonder why. That would be so cool.
Yeah. There's even Southeast Asia and
I'm sorry, I'm having
East and Southeast Asia has a higher prevalence of psychosis.
In their own countries?
Yeah. And it's not sure if it's for cultural diagnostic reasons, because even Japanese psychiatry has a different way of diagnosis. They're closer to classical German psychiatry sometimes. We hear sometimes see Japanese patients have psychosis, but it's just an anecdote.
This sounds very cool. I think you should pursue it. You've obviously thought a lot about it. I don't know too much about Japan. I think in Japanese, though, there's been an effort to change the name of schizophrenia to destigmatize. Sounds great. You have a mentor and supervisor. One of these two gentlemen in the front row, I'm sure, with especially culture and psychosis. Method, I'm trying to think other talks I've given, questions I've gotten. I think you guys have gotten them all. Again, think about, yeah.
Firstly, thank you for the lecture.
Oh, thanks.
Something that I didn't quite, I'm first year resident, so I don't have that much of clinical experience. But
yeah, I hope it was understandable.
Yeah,
I tried.
But one thing that came to me is that a lot of the features of the speech and of the facial expressions of the patients with schizophrenia, it seems to me that they would be also present in a lot of different clinical syndromes in psychiatry. For example, like the negative symptoms in schizophrenia. Also, you would be also able to identify the same features of speech and facial expression as severely depressed patient, for example, or the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, also in manic episodes, bipolar disorder. So how did you tackle the problem, or how would you tackle the problem of being specific enough for schizophrenia in subsequent studies? Or
So the clinical ratings will overlap more than the computational. The computational will show the subtle differences that the clinical ratings don't pick up. So, like I was saying, this thing with Action Unit 7 really seems specific.
For schizophrenia.
Yeah. We'll see. Natalia did her speech graph analysis, and others have done analyses of mania versus the psychosis in schizophrenia, right? So you saw that it kind of looked, it was words attached to one another, and she found in schizophrenia, I have it on my laptop, if you look at that same graph, the graph is like very sparse. And if you look at mania and bipolar, it's all over the place and elaborate, and then, the normal are kind of in between the two. So the language can really differentiate mania from regular psychosis. The face expression is one thing, and we'll see that it's like an empirical question, but so far what we're finding is that when you start quantitating, either, through like looking at coherence, and there's a million natural language processing, like we're also looking at use of metaphor. So there's so much you could do. When you get that level of detail and sensitivity is when you really have the opportunity to differentiate between diagnoses and to tie it into what the brain is doing. You can't tie a clinical rating to what the brain is doing, but you could tie in what this face muscle is doing with the motor cortex. You see what I'm saying? So you raise an excellent point. I think this technology will help to differentiate. But of course, then also you have a lot of comorbidity between things.
Yeah.
And it, one thing we found, so like in Alzheimer's, they kind of go off track a little, but also they perseverate. They're kind of saying the same thing over and over again. If people say the same thing over and over again in a way that's quite coherent, even though it's not normal. And we find all kinds of differences in behavior. So in schizophrenia, we find that people look down. In the autism studies, I have no idea why, everybody sits so that you can't see their mouth. You can only see their eyes. And the research assistants say, please adjust the screen so I could see your full face. And they'll change it a little bit, and they can see them, and it's we're like, what's that about? And then in adults with autism, high functioning autism, some of them have high IQ. They use words that are too formal. I don't know if that's true in Portuguese. They use words that like a professor should use, a little kid. And so then we're trying to model that. And the acoustics, so I'll tell you about this study we have in press at World Psychiatry. This is getting a little away from this specificity. It's in clinical high risk. So a group, the patients were from Shanghai, they spoke Chinese. We had healthy, it's just cross-section, healthy and clinical high risk. And actually, the sample size was small and their healthy controls were super normal, so it was a little bit problematic. However, the analyses, the natural language processing analyses were done in Chinese, and they were also done in English on the transcripts, and there were acoustic features. So all three of those models, very high accuracy, 80%. The interesting thing was for the natural language processing models in Chinese and English, the features, some of the features like coherence, et cetera, came up in both models and were highly correlated with one another. So it was, but then the Chinese model also looked at some features that you have in Chinese that you don't have in English. It's hard, I mean, I could start to describe it, but, and those features also like were predictive and we couldn't have captured them in English. So kind of the take home from this is like, it's a robust signal that you find, right? Like kind of whether you look at face or language or speech, at least for psychosis, and this is clinical high risk, they just look different. There's something about language, and I always thought this, so I'm glad it's panning out. If you think in schizophrenia, people go off track and they could be concrete. Schizophrenia has to be like that way around the world, unless you've heard something to the contrary. Is there a country where people develop schizophrenia where they don't kind of go off track and be tangential and they're not concrete? I haven't heard it. So it probably exists in all languages, but then the question is, how do you model that? How do you adapt to that specific language? But this coherence really seems to have, in English, what we say, have legs. It seems to, you know, you do research and you have a finding and you're like, oh, isn't that nice? You know, it's correlated. Let's write a paper, right? And you're like, I'm not sure I believe it. Then you do a second study, and you find it again. You're like, oh, this must be real. You know, it's not just statistically significant, but this must be real. So there's been that satisfaction in doing this research. But I encourage all of you to think about doing this kind of research in different diagnoses and therapy or whatever, thinking about ways. It's nice to work with computer scientists. Natalia will be here, and she's terrific. She did these analyses herself, and she's a psychiatrist. So, but like the kind of question that you came up with, any.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you. I'm looking forward to